I stared at my phone screen in complete disbelief, reading the bank balance over and over again. $0 and 0 cents. My heart hammered against my ribs as I refreshed the app, hoping desperately that some technical glitch had caused this nightmare. But the numbers remained unchanged. $250,000 had vanished from my savings account without a trace. This money represented 5 years of careful saving, overtime shifts, and sacrifice during my military deployment overseas. More importantly, it was meant to save my daughter's life. 3-year-old Emma needed heart surgery within weeks, and now I had nothing to pay for it. With trembling fingers, I called my parents' house, praying they might have some explanation for this impossible situation that was unfolding before me. I drove through the dawn light toward my parents' suburban Denver home, my mind racing with questions and growing dread. The morning air felt crisp against my face as I pulled into their driveway, but nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered next. Their front yard had been transformed into a wedding wonderland. Massive white silk tents stretched across the lawn, supported by elegant poles wrapped in cascading ivy. Crystal chandeliers hung from temporary wooden frames, catching the early sunlight and casting rainbow patterns across perfectly manicured grass. Imported orchids and roses filled elaborate arrangements, positioned throughout the space, their exotic fragrance mixing with the scent of fresh-cut flowers. Carol. My mother emerged from the house wearing a flowing emerald dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Her silver hair had been professionally styled, and diamond earrings sparkled against her neck. She greeted me with a smile that seemed almost predatory in its sweetness. "Wallace, darling, what brings you here so early?" she asked, adjusting a centerpiece filled with white peonies. "Mom, my entire savings account is empty. $250,000 just disappeared overnight. I need to know if you've seen anything unusual, any suspicious activity." My voice cracked with desperation as I spoke. Carol's expression shifted, and she let out a laugh that chilled my blood. "Oh, honey, we borrowed that money. Thanks for funding your sister's wedding. Jessica deserves something beautiful, don't you think?" The world seemed to tilt beneath my feet. "Borrowed, Mom, that money was for Emma's heart surgery. She could die without it." "You'll figure something out. You always do. Besides, we'll pay you back someday when we can afford it." She waved her hand dismissively, as if discussing pocket change rather than my daughter's life. My father Dan appeared from behind the house, struggling to carry folding chairs. His usual confident demeanor seemed shaken, and he avoided making eye contact with me. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning temperature. "Dad, please tell me Mom is joking. Tell me you didn't actually take Emma's surgery money." Dan set down the chairs and wiped his hands on his khaki pants. "Son, it's complicated. Family obligations, you understand. Jessica needed help, and we knew you'd want to support your sister. How did you even access my account? That deployment power of attorney expired 2 years ago." Dan's face flushed red, and he glanced nervously toward Carol. "I might have needed to update some paperwork. Nothing illegal, just family helping family." Something in his tone made my stomach drop. "What kind of paperwork, Dad?" Carol stepped between us, her voice turning sharp. "Wallace, you're being dramatic. No one will believe you're this upset over money when Jessica's happiness is at stake. Her new husband, Brad, is a prominent attorney in this city. He has connections everywhere. Maybe you should consider what's best for the whole family before making accusations." The threat in her words was unmistakable. As I looked around at the expensive decorations, the professional catering setup being assembled, and the luxury cars already arriving for the celebration, I realized my parents had spent far more than just my savings. This wedding represented a level of extravagance that suggested serious planning and significant additional investment. Dan disappeared into the house and returned with a manila folder, his hands shaking slightly. Inside, I glimpsed documents with my signature, but something looked wrong about the handwriting. The letter seemed slightly off, as if someone had practiced copying my style. You forged my signature. I whispered the reality hitting me like a physical blow. I did what I had to do for this family, Dan replied, but his voice lacked conviction. I pulled out my phone and began photographing the documents before Dan could stop me. The evidence was clear, fresh ink on papers dated just last month using letterhead from my old bank. My father had created entirely new authorization forms far beyond anything covered by my expired power of attorney. This isn't borrowing, Dad. This is fraud, federal fraud. Carol stepped forward, her emerald dress rustling. You think anyone will believe you over us? We've lived in this community for 30 years. You've been away playing soldier. Brad has friends in the police department, the district attorney's office, even the mayor's office. Who do you think they'll listen to? The weight of their betrayal settled on my shoulders like lead. Not only had they stolen Emma's surgery money, but they'd planned this crime carefully and positioned themselves to avoid consequences. As I walked back to my truck, I could hear Carol directing workers to hang more decorations, her voice bright and cheerful, as if our conversation had never happened. But she had made one crucial mistake. In her arrogance, she had allowed me to document Dan's forged paperwork. As I drove away, I began forming a plan that would require patience, careful timing, and help from people I trusted more than my own family. I stood in my bedroom that Saturday morning, staring at my military dress uniform hanging in the closet. The navy blue fabric with its brass buttons and colorful ribbons represented 5 years of service, sacrifice, and honor. If my parents wanted to play games with family loyalty, I would remind everyone exactly what I had given for my country while they lived comfortably at home. The wedding ceremony took place at Whitmore Mansion, a historic estate on the outskirts of Denver, with sprawling gardens and a grand ballroom that could accommodate 500 guests. Valets in white jackets directed luxury cars along the circular driveway, while photographers captured every moment of arriving guests. The mansion's limestone facade gleamed in the afternoon sunshine, and topiary gardens provided an elegant backdrop for the celebration. I had not received an invitation, but I walked through the front entrance as if I belonged there. My uniform drew respectful nods from older guests, many of whom probably assumed I was Jessica's military brother attending to support her special day. The irony burned in my chest. Jessica looked radiant in her designer gown, a flowing creation of French lace and silk that probably cost more than most people earned in months. Her auburn hair had been styled in an elaborate updo, decorated with tiny pearls, and her bouquet featured rare white roses flown in from Ecuador. She was surrounded by 6 bridesmaids in matching lavender dresses, each holding smaller versions of her exotic bouquet. When our eyes met across the crowded reception area, guilt flashed across her face. Before she quickly looked away, she whispered something to her maid of honor, who glanced in my direction with obvious discomfort. Brad the groom commanded attention in his expensive tuxedo. Tall and broad-shouldered, with perfectly styled blonde hair, he moved through the crowd like a politician, shaking hands and sharing jokes with apparent ease. His confident smile never wavered, and his laugh carried across the room whenever someone told him congratulations. During cocktail hour, I positioned myself near the bar, where groups of groomsmen had gathered to celebrate. Brad held court in the center, regaling his friends with stories about his successful law practice. The bartender, a young woman with short black hair, served drinks while clearly eavesdropping on the conversation. The trick is creative accounting, Brad said, loosening his bow tie and accepting another whiskey. Wealthy clients don't want to pay taxes on certain income streams. They need someone who understands how to make money disappear and reappear in more favorable circumstances. His college roommate, a heavyset man named Kevin, laughed and raised his glass. You always were the smartest guy in our fraternity. Remember when you talked your way out of that academic dishonesty charge? Different skills, same principle. You find the right pressure points, make the right connections, and suddenly problems solve themselves. Brad's eyes glittered with alcohol and arrogance. I activated the voice recording app on my phone, holding it casually, while pretending to check messages. The conversation continued for nearly 20 minutes, with Brad providing increasingly specific details about his methods for hiding client assets. "The beauty is in the legal settlements," he continued. "I create fictional lawsuits, fictional defendants, fictional resolutions. Money goes in dirty, comes out clean through legitimate legal channels. The documentation looks perfect because it is perfect. I've got connections in 3 different states who help process the paperwork." One of his younger colleagues, obviously impressed, asked about the amounts involved. "We're talking millions, Jake. I've got one client who moved $8 million through my system in the past 18 months. Another guy brought me $12 million from some overseas ventures he couldn't explain through normal banking. The commission structure makes it very profitable for everyone involved." Brad mentioned specific names of clients, dollar amounts, and even bank account numbers in different states. His drunken bragging provided a detailed confession to money laundering operations that clearly extended far beyond anything I had initially suspected. When the reception moved into the ballroom, I found Jessica standing alone near a window overlooking the mansion's rose garden. She wore a strained expression despite her beautiful surroundings. "Congratulations," I said, quietly approaching from her left side. She turned and tears immediately filled her eyes. "Wallace, I'm so sorry. I tried to stop them, but Mom said you would understand. Family comes first. Did you know about Emma's surgery money?" Jessica nodded miserably. "I found out 2 days ago. I begged them to return it, but Brad said it was too late. The money had already been spent on deposits and contracts." "What about Brad's business? Did you know about his creative accounting methods?" Her face went pale. "What do you mean?" I lowered my voice, glancing around to make sure no one could overhear us. "Your husband just spent the last hour describing his money laundering operation to his friends." "Jessica? He's not just a successful attorney. He's washing money for criminals." "That's impossible. Brad handles estate planning and business contracts." "I recorded him confessing to specific crimes, mentioning client names and dollar amounts. He's been using fake legal settlements to clean dirty money." Jessica pressed her hand against her stomach, and I noticed for the first time that her dress had been carefully tailored to conceal a slight bump. "You're pregnant," I realized. 3 months, she whispered. "Wallace, I can't handle this right now. Brad said if I called off the wedding, he would leave me. My entire future, my baby's future, depends on this marriage working." The pieces suddenly clicked into place. Jessica wasn't just a willing participant in stealing my money. She was another victim trapped by circumstances and threats she couldn't escape. But her situation didn't change the fact that Emma still needed surgery, and every day of delay increased the risk to my daughter's life. As the evening progressed, I watched Brad continue drinking and sharing details about his illegal activities with anyone who would listen. His overconfidence would be his downfall, but I needed professional help to turn his admissions into actionable evidence. The wedding reception continued around us with elaborate dinner service, live music, and dancing that would last until midnight. But beneath the surface celebration, I now understood that this entire event represented the intersection of multiple crimes, fraud, money laundering, and possibly much more. My stolen money had funded a criminal's wedding, making my parents unwitting accomplices in a conspiracy that reached far beyond our family. Monday morning found me sitting in a small conference room at the Denver FBI field office, across from my old Army buddy Marcus Chen, who had joined the Bureau after completing his military service. Marcus wore a crisp black suit and maintained the same focused intensity that had made him an exceptional intelligence analyst during our deployment together. "Wallace, when you called yesterday, I thought you were dealing with simple family fraud. But after listening to these recordings and examining those forged documents, I need to tell you something that's going to shock you." Marcus opened a thick file folder and spread photographs across the conference table. The images showed Brad entering and leaving various office buildings, meeting with men in expensive suits, and handling briefcases in parking garages. We've been investigating Bradford Morrison for 8 months as part of Operation Clean Slate, a joint task force targeting organized crime money laundering in the Rocky Mountain region. Your recordings contain admissions to specific crimes we've been trying to prove involving clients we've been trying to identify. My hands trembled as I realized the implications. Are you saying my daughter's surgery money was stolen to fund a wedding for someone under federal investigation? It's worse than that. Based on what Brad confessed on tape, your parents didn't just steal money. They unknowingly helped legitimize proceeds from drug trafficking, illegal gambling, and possibly human trafficking. The wedding expenses served as a way to convert dirty money into legitimate expenditures. Marcus pulled out surveillance photographs showing Carol and Dan at various banks accompanied by Brad during what appeared to be official business meetings. Your mother signed papers establishing her as an authorized representative for several shell companies Brad created. She probably thought she was helping with wedding planning, but she was actually facilitating money transfers between criminal organizations. The room felt like it was spinning. My parents are going to prison. Not necessarily. If they cooperate fully and can demonstrate they were manipulated rather than willing participants, the prosecutor might offer plea agreements. But Wallace, there's something else you need to know about Brad's operation. Marcus opened another file, this one, containing military service records and financial documents. Brad specifically targets military families during deployments. He identifies servicemen with substantial savings, then uses personal connections to gain access to their accounts. Your case led us to discover a pattern we hadn't recognized before. He showed me a list of 12 names, all active duty military personnel, who had lost significant amounts of money through similar schemes during overseas assignments. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez lost $90,000 intended for his wife's cancer treatment. Captain Williams lost $120,000 from his children's college funds. Lieutenant Foster lost $80,000 meant for his father's nursing home care. The total theft exceeds $3 million. Each name represented a family destroyed by Brad's systematic exploitation of military sacrifice. These weren't random crimes of opportunity, but calculated attacks on people serving their country. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "We need you to act completely normal while we position resources for a coordinated arrest. Brad cannot suspect that we're closing in, or he'll destroy evidence and flee. His organization has contacts in Mexico and the Cayman Islands where he could disappear permanently." Marcus handed me a small electronic device that looked like a car key fob. "This is a recording transmitter. If you have any contact with your parents or Brad, activate it, and we'll capture everything." "But Wallace, there's one more thing." He pulled out a medical file with Emma's name on it. "We contacted Dr. Sullivan at Children's Hospital about Emma's condition. She confirmed that your daughter's surgery cannot wait much longer without significantly increased risks." The weight of competing priorities crashed down on me. Pursuing justice might eventually recover my money and help other military families, but Emma needed surgery within days. Even if the FBI arrest succeeded immediately, legal proceedings to recover stolen funds could take months or years. "There might be a solution," Marcus said carefully. "The Veterans Affairs Office has an emergency medical fund for situations exactly like this. If we can document that Emma's condition resulted from delayed treatment caused by financial crimes targeting military personnel, they can authorize immediate funding for her surgery." Hope flickered in my chest for the first time in days. "The catch is that we need your parents' cooperation to establish the timeline and Brad's methods. They have to admit their involvement and provide detailed testimony about how Brad manipulated them into accessing your accounts." I thought about Carol's arrogant laughter and Dan's guilty avoidance. Getting them to confess would require confronting the reality that their actions had endangered their granddaughter's life. What if they refused to cooperate? Then we proceed with the investigation, using the evidence we have. But recovery of your funds becomes uncertain, and Emma's surgery gets delayed while we explore other funding options. Marcus gathered the photographs and files, his expression grim. Wallace, I need you to understand something. Brad Morrison isn't just a white-collar criminal. His clients include people who hurt others for a living. If he realizes you're the source of our information, you and your family could be in physical danger. The conference room suddenly felt very cold. I had entered this situation thinking about fraud and theft, but now I understood that Emma and I had become entangled with organized crime through my parents' greed and Brad's manipulation. How long do we have? Jessica's pregnancy gives us a small window. Brad won't want to disrupt his new wife's condition by running immediately. But if he starts feeling pressure from his criminal clients about delayed payments or increased law enforcement activity, that calculation could change quickly. As I left the FBI building, I realized that saving Emma's life now depended on convincing my parents to admit their crimes and testify against a dangerous criminal who had manipulated them into betraying their own son. The next few days would determine whether justice and family could coexist or whether I would have to choose between them. I drove to my parents' house Thursday evening, wearing a wire device so sophisticated it was invisible beneath my shirt. Marcus had spent an hour that afternoon teaching me how to activate it with a simple gesture, how to position myself for optimal audio quality, and most importantly, how to guide conversations towards specific topics without seeming obvious. The wedding decorations had been removed, but their house still felt different somehow. Fresh flowers filled vases throughout the living room, and new furniture had replaced their old couch and coffee table. Carol wore expensive jewelry I had never seen before, while Dan seemed jumpy and distracted. I need to talk to you both about Emma's condition. I began settling into their new leather armchair. Her cardiologist says we have maybe 4 more days before the surgery window closes. Carol continued arranging white lilies in a crystal vase, her movements precise and uncaring. Wallace, we've been over this. The money is gone. You need to find another solution. Mom, she's your granddaughter. She calls you Grandma Carol and draws you pictures. How can you be so cold about her dying? Don't be dramatic. Children's hospitals have charity programs. Apply for assistance like everyone else. Dan shifted uncomfortably on the new sofa, his hands fidgeting with the remote control. Son, maybe there's a way to work something out. Some kind of payment plan or loan arrangement. From who you spent every penny I saved. The wedding cost more than my annual salary. Carol laughed, the same cruel sound that had haunted my sleep for days. Jessica deserved a proper celebration. She married well better than we ever hoped. Brad has connections that will benefit our entire family for years to come. What kind of connections, Mom? She paused in her flower, arranging a secretive smile crossing her face. Important people, business leaders, political figures. Brad handles legal affairs for clients who appreciate discretion and reward loyalty. Has Brad been calling you since the wedding? Dan's face flushed immediately. How did you know about that? Carol shot him a sharp look that could have cut glass. Daniel, shut your mouth. Dad, what has Brad been telling you? Dan stood up and began pacing near the window, his nervous energy filling the room. He's been giving us advice about how to handle your situation, making sure we understand the bigger picture. What bigger picture? Wallace needs to understand that accidents happen to people who ask too many questions. Carol's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but the wire would capture every syllable. Brad was very clear about that. My blood turned to ice. They were repeating a direct threat against my life, made by a man under federal investigation for money laundering. Marcus would have everything he needed to add witness intimidation and extortion to the charges. Are you saying Brad threatened me? I'm saying smart people know when to walk away from problems they can't solve, Carol replied, returning to her flowers with renewed focus. Dan stopped pacing and turned toward me. His face crumpled with obvious internal conflict. Son, I'm scared. Brad has been calling every day since the wedding. He wants us to transfer money from our retirement accounts, says it's necessary to complete the cycle. What cycle, Dad? I don't understand it all. Something about moving funds through legitimate family transactions to avoid government attention. He said your military background makes our family perfect for his needs. Carol whirled around, her composure finally cracking. Daniel, if you say another word, so help me God. Carol, look at what we've done. We stole money from our own son's dying child. Emma could die because of our greed. Dan collapsed back onto the sofa, his face buried in his hands. I forged those documents because Brad said it was just a temporary transfer. He promised the money would be returned before you ever noticed it was gone. But then he started talking about additional opportunities, ways to make the arrangement permanent. What additional opportunities? He wants access to your current military pay accounts, your VA benefits, your security clearance information. He said military credentials open doors that civilian identities cannot. The scope of Brad's scheme suddenly became clear. He wasn't just stealing from military families, he was trying to infiltrate military financial systems using compromised service members as unwitting accomplices. Carol moved toward Dan with fury in her eyes. You stupid man, you're destroying everything we built. We built nothing, Carol. We destroyed our son's trust, endangered our granddaughter's life, and got involved with criminals. Dan looked at me with tears streaming down his face. Wallace, I was gambling again. Online poker, sports betting, cryptocurrency trading. I lost $30,000 from our savings money we needed for property taxes and medical bills. When Brad offered to solve our financial problems in exchange for small favors, I thought it was a gift from heaven. What small favors? First, just information about your deployment schedule and pay structure. Then copying some of your old paperwork. Finally, creating new documents that would give us access to your accounts during emergencies. Carol threw her crystal vase against the wall, where it shattered into hundreds of pieces. Daniel, you've just confessed to federal crimes while talking to someone who might be recording every word. She turned to stare directly at me, her eyes narrow with suspicion. Wallace, are you wearing a wire? The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. If I denied it and she somehow discovered the device, my credibility would be destroyed and the investigation compromised. If I admitted it, they might stop talking or even become violent. Mom, Emma is dying. If you've done something illegal that could help recover her surgery money, don't you think law enforcement should know about it? Carol's face went through several emotions before settling on cold calculation. Brad warned us you might try something like this. He said if you became a problem, there were people who could make you disappear permanently. Dan jumped up from the sofa. Carol, stop your talking about murdering our son. I'm talking about protecting our family from someone who would destroy his own parents to get money. The conversation had provided Marcus with everything he needed: confessions to fraud, evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy, direct threats against my life, and proof that Brad was targeting military personnel systematically. But it had also confirmed my worst fears about how far my parents had fallen into criminality. As I prepared to leave, Dan grabbed my arm with desperate strength. Son, I know you'll never forgive me, but please don't let them hurt Emma because of my mistakes. She's innocent in all this. Walking back to my truck, I realized that saving Emma now depended on the FBI's ability to arrest Brad and his associates before they realized their operation had been compromised. The wire recording would provide the evidence needed for immediate action, but it would also make my family targets for retaliation. Marcus had warned me that cooperation with federal investigations sometimes required sacrificing personal relationships for the greater good. Tonight I had chosen Emma's life over my parents' freedom, and there would be no going back from that decision. Saturday evening brought an invitation I never expected to receive. Jessica called, her voice shaky and exhausted, asking if I would attend a belated wedding celebration at the same mansion where her original reception had been held. Brad wants to apologize for the family tension, she explained. He's planned a smaller party, just close family and a few business associates. He thinks if we can all talk openly, we can resolve the money situation. I knew immediately that this was the FBI's opportunity. Marcus had explained that Brad would feel most secure surrounded by his criminal associates, making him likely to discuss business matters that would provide additional evidence for prosecution. "Of course I'll be there," I told Jessica. "Family is family." The mansion looked different on this second visit. Instead of 500 guests, only about 50 people moved through the ballroom and gardens. The catering was more modest, though still elegant, and the atmosphere felt more intimate despite the underlying tension. Brad greeted me at the entrance wearing a navy suit and an expression of practiced sincerity. "Wallace, I'm glad you came. Jessica has been worried about the strain this money situation has put on family relationships. I appreciate the invitation. Emma's condition is getting worse, so I'm hoping we can find a solution." "Absolutely. In fact, I've been working on some creative financing options that might help with medical expenses." We moved through the reception area where I recognized several faces from the original wedding, along with new guests who carried themselves with the confident bearing of successful businessmen. 3 men near the bar wore expensive suits but had the hard eyes and careful postures of people accustomed to violence. Carol and Dan stood near the windows overlooking the rose garden, both looking uncomfortable and out of place among Brad's associates. Carol wore a black cocktail dress that emphasized her nervous demeanor, while Dan kept checking his watch as if counting minutes until escape. During cocktail hour, Brad gathered his inner circle near the mansion's library, a wood-paneled room lined with leather-bound books and furnished with antique chairs. I positioned myself near the doorway, where I could observe and listen without appearing intrusive. "The military pipeline is producing excellent results," Brad told a gray-haired man with expensive jewelry. "We've identified 16 additional targets across 3 military bases. The beauty is that deployment schedules are public information, making it easy to time our approaches." A younger associate with a Brooklyn accent asked about expansion possibilities. "What about Air Force personnel, Navy deployments?" "Already in progress. I've got connections at financial institutions near major military facilities. When someone deploys, their family members often need help managing finances. We provide that help, along with access to accounts that generate significant liquidity." The gray-haired man laughed approvingly. "How much liquidity are we discussing?" "Conservative estimate 8 to 10 million in accessible funds across current targets. The risk is minimal because military personnel are trained to follow orders and respect authority. When their parents or spouses receive official-looking documents, they rarely question the legitimacy." My phone vibrated with a text message from Marcus. "Teams in position, 5 minutes." Through the library windows, I could see black SUVs positioning themselves along the mansion's circular driveway. Additional vehicles blocked the service entrances and garden pathways, creating a perimeter that would prevent escape attempts. Brad continued his explanation to increasingly interested listeners. "The key is creating legitimate business fronts that can process large transactions without attracting scrutiny. Wedding expenses, home renovations, medical procedures, educational costs. Money goes in dirty, comes out clean, and everyone profits." One of the hard-eyed men asked about law enforcement risks. "Minimal. I've got contacts in local police departments, the district attorney's office, even some federal positions. Information flows both ways, keeping us ahead of any investigations." At exactly 9:15, the mansion's front entrance exploded inward as federal agents in tactical gear streamed through the doorway. Shouts of "FBI, get down!" echoed through the ballroom as guests screamed and dove for cover behind tables and furniture. Brad's reaction was immediate panic. Instead of surrendering, he bolted toward the library's rear exit, shouting threats and instructions as he ran. "Destroy the laptops, delete everything. If anyone talks, they're dead." His desperate flight took him through the kitchen, where he encountered more federal agents blocking his escape route. Trapped between 2 teams, Brad began screaming specific information about offshore bank accounts, safety deposit boxes, and hidden assets that he had never mentioned during his earlier recorded confessions. "The money is in Grand Cayman accounts, under Morrison Holdings safety deposit box. 473 at First National contains bearer bonds worth $2 million. The ranch property in Montana has $3 million buried behind the stable. Federal agents recorded every word as Brad's panic caused him to reveal details about criminal proceeds that the investigation had not yet discovered. His desperation to negotiate or flee was providing prosecutors with evidence of financial crimes extending far beyond money laundering. In the ballroom, Jessica collapsed into a chair, her hands pressed against her stomach, as the stress of the raid triggered obvious pregnancy complications. Paramedics immediately attended to her, while agents sorted through guests to identify witnesses versus suspects. Carol stood frozen near the shattered remains of a champagne glass, her face white with shock and disbelief. "Wallace, you did this. You destroyed our family." Dan suffered what appeared to be a mild heart attack, clutching his chest and gasping for breath as paramedics rushed to his assistance. The stress and guilt of months of criminal activity, combined with the shock of federal arrest, had overwhelmed his cardiovascular system. "Sir, we need to get you to a hospital immediately," a paramedic told Dan while checking his vital signs. Federal agents moved efficiently through the crowd, making arrests based on surveillance evidence and recorded conversations. The gray-haired man and his Brooklyn associate were handcuffed along with 6 other guests identified as participants in Brad's money laundering network. Local news crews arrived within minutes, their cameras capturing dramatic footage of federal agents escorting suspects from the mansion in handcuffs. The scene would dominate Denver television coverage for the next week, with headlines about organized crime infiltration of military families. Marcus found me near the garden entrance, his expression grim but satisfied. "We got everything we needed and more." Brad's panic confession revealed criminal assets we didn't know existed, probably enough to compensate every victim with full restitution. What about my parents? Dan's cooperation and obvious remorse will work in his favor. The medical emergency supports arguments that he was manipulated rather than willingly criminal. Carol's situation is more complicated because of her threatening statements and continued defiance. As paramedics loaded Dan into an ambulance, he reached out to grab my hand. "Son, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything." Carol refused to acknowledge me as federal agents placed her under arrest, her face set in lines of bitter resentment that suggested she blamed me entirely for the consequences of her choices. Jessica rode in a separate ambulance to be evaluated for pregnancy complications, her wedding dream transformed into a nightmare that would require years to process and overcome. The mansion, which had hosted elegant celebrations just hours earlier, now stood empty except for federal investigators cataloging evidence and documenting the scene. The contrast between wedding luxury and criminal justice created images that would stay with me forever. Marcus handed me a business card for the Veterans Affairs Emergency Medical Coordinator. "Call this number tomorrow morning. Emma's surgery funding has been approved through the Military Victim Assistance Program. She can have her operation at Children's Hospital next week." For the first time in days, I felt something approaching relief. Justice was being served, Emma would receive her life-saving surgery, and the truth about Brad's criminal network was finally exposed. But the personal cost of family betrayal would take much longer to heal. 3 weeks after the mansion raid, I sat in Marcus's office reviewing evidence that revealed the true scope of Brad's criminal enterprise. The investigation had uncovered a sophisticated network targeting military families across 7 states with stolen funds totaling more than $8 million over 3 years. "Wallace, your case broke this whole thing open, but you need to understand how extensive the damage really is," Marcus said, spreading files across his desk. The first folder contained information about Staff Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez, whose wife Maria had been battling breast cancer during his deployment to Afghanistan. Brad's associates had approached Maria with official-looking documents, authorizing them to help manage the family's finances during Tommy's absence. They systematically drained $90,000 intended for Maria's chemotherapy treatments. Maria died 3 months after Tommy returned home, Marcus explained quietly. Her cancer had progressed too far without proper treatment. Tommy blames himself for trusting strangers with his family's financial security. The second file documented Captain Sarah Mitchell, a helicopter pilot whose parents fell victim to Brad's scheme while she was deployed to Iraq. Her elderly father needed nursing home care for dementia, and her mother had signed papers giving Brad's associates access to Sarah's savings account. They stole $120,000, forcing Sarah's parents to move her father to a substandard facility where he died within 6 months. These aren't just financial crimes, I realized. People died because of what Brad did. Exactly. The federal prosecutor is considering murder charges in connection with deaths that resulted from delayed medical treatment. Marcus opened a third file containing photographs of Lieutenant Kevin Foster, a young officer whose deployment pay had been systematically stolen to fund his sister's addiction recovery. Without money for a quality treatment program, Kevin's sister had overdosed on fentanyl just days before Kevin returned home. The pattern is always the same, Marcus continued. Brad identifies military personnel with substantial savings, then uses family emergencies or celebrations to justify accessing their accounts. Weddings, medical crises, educational expenses, home repairs. The money gets stolen, families suffer, and service members return home to discover their sacrifice meant nothing. Each story represented a family destroyed by greed and exploitation. These weren't random crimes of opportunity, but systematic attacks on people serving their country overseas. What about Brad's criminal clients who was actually benefiting from the money laundering? Marcus opened a larger file containing surveillance photographs and financial records. 3 main organizations. The Castellano family runs drug distribution from Colorado to Chicago. The Morrison ring, no relation to Brad despite the name handles illegal gambling and loan sharking. The third group specializes in human trafficking, moving people across the Mexican border for forced labor. The photographs showed meetings between Brad and men whose faces belonged on law enforcement wanted posters. Money had flowed from drug sales, illegal gambling profits, and human trafficking proceeds through Brad's legal office and into seemingly legitimate investments. Your stolen money helped purchase rental properties in Denver that were used as safe houses for trafficking operations. Jessica's wedding expenses legitimized drug profits that had been sitting in offshore accounts for months. The realization that Emma's surgery money had funded criminal enterprises made my stomach turn. My daughter's medical crisis had been exploited to facilitate organized crime operations that hurt other families. There's something else you need to know about your parents' involvement, Marcus said carefully. Dan's gambling addiction wasn't coincidental. Brad's associates specifically targeted him because they knew about your military savings. Marcus showed me casino surveillance footage of Dan playing poker at an underground gambling establishment. The other players at his table were Brad's criminal associates who had deliberately encouraged his losses and offered financial solutions that required accessing my accounts. They set him up. Dan thought he was getting help from new friends, but he was actually being recruited into a criminal conspiracy. His desperation and guilt made him an ideal target for manipulation. The evidence showed months of careful planning designed to exploit Dan's weaknesses and Carol's social ambitions. Brad had positioned himself as Jessica's perfect husband while simultaneously developing leverage over my parents through gambling debts and financial pressure. Carol's involvement is more complicated. She knew Brad's business involved wealthy clients with questionable backgrounds, but she chose to ignore warning signs because she enjoyed the social status and financial benefits. Marcus pulled out recorded phone conversations between Carol and Brad, discussing my military service record deployment schedule and financial information. Her voice sounded eager and cooperative as she provided details that would help Brad plan his approach. Your mother wasn't just a victim, Wallace. She was an active participant who helped Brad identify you as a target. The betrayal cut deeper than simple theft. Carol had deliberately provided information that enabled Brad to steal Emma's surgery money, knowing that her granddaughter needed medical treatment. What happens now? Brad pleads guilty next week. He's facing 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole. His criminal associates are either in custody or fleeing the country. The money laundering network has been completely dismantled. Marcus handed me a check for $250,000 plus interest and penalty damages awarded by the federal court. Emma's surgery was successful, and she's recovering beautifully. This money can go toward her future education or medical needs. What about the other military families? Full restitution for everyone. Brad's seized assets, including properties and offshore accounts, provided enough money to compensate all victims with additional damages for pain and suffering. Marcus showed me letters from other military families expressing gratitude for my role in exposing Brad's network. Tommy Rodriguez had written thanking me for ensuring that Maria's death would lead to justice for other families. Captain Mitchell described how the recovered money would fund a scholarship in her father's memory. Your decision to wear that wire and confront your parents saved lives, Wallace. Other military families won't suffer because Brad's operation has been destroyed. But personal satisfaction remained complicated. Dan was serving 6 months in federal prison, followed by 2 years of community service, his sentence reduced because of his cooperation and genuine remorse. Carol had received 2 years in minimum security prison after pleading guilty to fraud and conspiracy charges. Jessica's pregnancy is progressing normally despite the stress. She's filed for divorce and moved back to her maiden name. The baby will be born free from Brad's influence. The folder contained a letter from Jessica expressing her gratitude for exposing the truth about Brad before their child was born into a criminal family. She had started counseling to process the trauma of discovering that her husband was a predator who had manipulated her into unwitting participation in organized crime. Recovery takes time, Marcus concluded. But justice has been served, and dangerous criminals are in prison where they can't hurt other families. As I left the FBI building, I reflected on how family loyalty can become corrupted when it conflicts with moral principles. My parents had chosen greed over their granddaughter's welfare, but their actions had ultimately led to dismantling a criminal network that might have continued destroying military families for years. The next challenge would be rebuilding relationships with the family members who remained while ensuring that Emma grew up understanding the difference between love and exploitation. 6 months after Brad's arrest, I stood in the federal courthouse listening to Judge Patricia Thompson deliver his final sentence. The courtroom was packed with military families whose lives had been destroyed by his systematic theft and money laundering operation. Bradford Morrison, you have pleaded guilty to 23 felony counts, including money laundering, fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit organized crime. Your actions targeted military service members and their families during their most vulnerable moments, exploiting their sacrifice for our country to fund criminal enterprises. Judge Thompson's voice carried the weight of moral authority as she continued. The court sentences you to 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole, followed by 10 years of supervised probation. You will forfeit all assets, properties, and financial instruments used in furtherance of these crimes. Brad stood silently as bailiffs prepared to escort him back to prison. His expensive suits had been replaced by orange jail clothing, and his confident demeanor had disappeared entirely. The man who had once bragged about his criminal connections now appeared small and defeated. Additionally, you will pay full restitution to all victims, including medical expenses, lost wages, and punitive damages totaling $12.3 million. Tommy Rodriguez sat in the front row wearing his military dress uniform with a photograph of his late wife Maria pinned to his chest. Captain Sarah Mitchell attended with her elderly mother, both women finding closure in seeing justice delivered for the crimes that had shortened her father's life. During the victim impact statements, I had spoken about Emma's successful heart surgery and her complete recovery. My daughter was now a healthy, energetic 4-year-old who loved drawing pictures and playing with toy horses. The surgery funded by the Veterans Affairs Emergency Program had been performed flawlessly by Dr. Sullivan and her cardiac team. My daughter will grow up healthy because other people stepped forward to help when her own family failed her, I had told the court. But she'll also grow up understanding that justice sometimes requires painful choices about the people we love. After the sentencing hearing, I drove to the Federal Correctional Facility where Dan was completing his community service requirement. I found him in the children's ward at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital reading stories to young patients undergoing cancer treatment. "Wallace," he said quietly when he saw me approaching. "I wasn't sure you'd come." Dan looked older than his 62 years, his hair completely gray, and his face marked by lines of regret and exhaustion. 6 months in prison had humbled him completely, stripping away the confident exterior that had masked his gambling addiction and financial desperation. "How's Emma doing?" "Perfect. Her cardiologist says her heart function is completely normal. She starts preschool next month." Dan's eyes filled with tears. "I think about her every day, about what I almost cost her." We sat together in the hospital chapel, a quiet space with stained glass windows and simple wooden pews. The sound of children's voices echoed from the nearby playroom, a reminder of the innocence that Dan's choices had endangered. "Dad, I need you to understand something. I forgave you months ago, but forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. You made choices that almost killed your granddaughter. I know. The counseling program here has helped me understand how addiction corrupted my judgment. I convinced myself that I was helping our family when I was actually destroying it." Dan pulled out a worn photograph of Emma from his wallet, her smiling face captured during a visit to the Denver Zoo before his arrest. "I've written her a letter for every day I've been in prison. 237 letters explaining how Grandpa made mistakes and hurt people he loved. Someday, when she's old enough to understand, I want her to know that actions have consequences even when the people we love are the ones making bad choices." The letters represented a grandfather's attempt to teach ethical lessons through his own failure. Dan's recognition of his crimes had evolved into genuine moral transformation, though it came at the cost of family relationships that might never fully heal. "What about your relationship with Mom?" Dan's expression darkened. "Your mother blames everyone except herself for what happened. She writes letters from prison claiming that you destroyed our family by cooperating with the FBI. She still doesn't understand that we destroyed ourselves by stealing from Emma's medical fund." Carol's continued denial contrasted sharply with Dan's acceptance of responsibility. Her letters to family members had been filled with resentment and self-pity, showing no recognition of how her choices had endangered her granddaughter's life. "Jessica brought the baby to see me last week," Dan continued. "Little Margaret is beautiful, healthy, and completely innocent of her father's crimes. Jessica is doing better than anyone expected considering everything she went through. Jessica had given birth to a daughter 3 months earlier, a moment of joy that helped heal some of the trauma from discovering her husband's criminal activities. She was working as a teacher while completing her graduate degree in social work planning to help other families recover from financial exploitation. She wants Emma to know her cousin despite everything that happened between our families." The children's voices from the playroom reminded me of Emma's laughter when she played with her friends. My daughter had recovered completely from her surgery and retained no memory of the crisis that had nearly cost her life. Her innocence was preserved while the adults around her dealt with consequences of choices made during her most vulnerable moments. "Dad, Emma asks about you sometimes. She remembers Grandpa Dan, who used to read her bedtime stories. What do you tell her?" "The truth in terms a 4-year-old can understand. Grandpa made some bad choices and had to go away for a while to learn how to make better choices. When he's ready, maybe he can read stories to her again." Dan wiped his eyes with a hospital tissue. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready to face her knowing what I almost took away from her." You will be ready when you can look at her and see possibility instead of guilt. She needs to understand that people can change, that mistakes don't have to define someone forever. Before leaving the hospital, I stopped by the children's ward to watch Dan finish reading stories to young cancer patients. His gentle voice and patient demeanor showed genuine care for children facing medical challenges similar to what Emma had experienced. The contrast between Dan's current service and his past choices illustrated the possibility of redemption through authentic remorse and meaningful action. His community service had evolved into a personal mission to help families dealing with medical crises, as if caring for other children could somehow balance the harm he had caused his own granddaughter. Driving home, I reflected on the lessons that had emerged from our family's crisis. Trust once broken by betrayal required years to rebuild through consistent actions rather than words. Justice had been served through legal proceedings, but healing required forgiveness that didn't excuse harmful behavior or ignore consequences. Emma was waiting for me at home, playing with building blocks in our living room, while my neighbor Mrs. Patterson watched her. At 4 years old, Emma radiated the health and energy that her surgery had restored, unaware of how close she had come to losing everything. "Daddy, look what I built," she called, pointing to an elaborate castle constructed from wooden blocks. "That's beautiful, sweetheart. Tell me about it." Emma explained each room of her castle with the detailed imagination that healthy children possess. Her heart surgery scar was barely visible beneath her shirt, and her energy levels were completely normal according to her recent medical checkup. "This room is for people who made mistakes, but learned to be better," she said, pointing to a small tower connected to the main structure. "Everyone gets a second chance if they try really hard." Her innocent wisdom captured the essence of what our family had learned through crisis. Redemption was possible, but it required acknowledging harm, accepting consequences, and demonstrating change through sustained action over time. That evening, I established a college fund for Emma, using the restitution money recovered from Brad's criminal assets. The account would grow over 14 years, ensuring that her future education would be funded by justice rather than theft. I also created a foundation to help military families facing medical emergencies, using the additional damages awarded by the federal court. The foundation would provide immediate funding for children's surgeries, preventing other families from experiencing the terror of watching their child suffer while criminals profit from their sacrifice. The foundation's first recipient was Tommy Rodriguez, whose late wife's medical expenses had bankrupted their family despite his military service. The funding would establish a scholarship in Maria's name for nursing students studying oncology care. 6 months later, Dan completed his prison sentence and community service requirements, emerging from the criminal justice system as a genuinely transformed person. His first request was permission to attend Emma's 5th birthday party, not as a returning family member, but as someone seeking forgiveness for endangering her life. Emma's birthday celebration was held at our house with friends from her preschool class, and their parents joining us for cake and games in the backyard. Dan arrived with a hand-carved wooden dollhouse that he had created during his community service hours, each room painted with careful detail and love. "Happy birthday, Emma," he said quietly, kneeling to her level while offering the gift. Emma examined the dollhouse with 5-year-old wonder, running her small fingers over the intricate woodwork and tiny furniture. "Grandpa Dan, did you make this for me?" "I did, sweetheart. I wanted to give you something beautiful because you're the most important person in my world." Emma hugged him spontaneously, her natural affection overcoming the complex adult emotions surrounding their relationship. "Thank you, Grandpa Dan. Will you help me play with it?" For the next hour, Dan and Emma played together on our living room floor, his patience and gentle attention demonstrating the grandfather he was learning to become rather than the one he had been. Their interaction showed healing in progress, though full restoration would require years of consistent behavior. Jessica attended the party with baby Margaret, now 6 months old, and beginning to smile at faces and sounds around her. Jessica had rebuilt her life, completely moving past Brad's manipulation to create stability for herself and her daughter. Wallace. I can never thank you enough for exposing Brad before Margaret was born, she told me while we watched our daughters play together. She'll grow up free from his influence because you chose justice over family loyalty. The birthday party represented new beginnings, built on truthfulness, rather than the deception that had nearly destroyed our family. Emma's health and happiness were preserved, the criminals who had exploited military families were in prison, and the surviving family members were learning to rebuild relationships based on honesty rather than manipulation. As guests prepared to leave, Dan asked if he could speak with me privately. We walked to the front porch, where evening light cast long shadows across our neighborhood. Son, I know I can't undo the harm I caused, but I want you to know that every day of my community service taught me something about the value of helping rather than hurting. I want to spend whatever years I have left earning your forgiveness and Emma's trust. Dad, you've already started earning both. But forgiveness is a process, not an event. Emma needs to see consistency over time before she can fully trust again. I understand. I'm prepared to spend the rest of my life proving that people can change when they face the truth about their mistakes. Dan's commitment to genuine transformation offered hope that family relationships could be rebuilt on stronger foundations than before. His recognition of harm and acceptance of consequences created possibilities for redemption that wouldn't have existed without honest accountability. Carol remained in federal prison, her letters showing continued denial and resentment toward family members who had chosen justice over covering up her crimes. Her refusal to accept responsibility meant that reconciliation remained impossible until she acknowledged the harm her choices had caused. Emma's story became a symbol of resilience for other military families facing similar crises. Her complete recovery and joyful personality demonstrated that children could overcome trauma when surrounded by adults willing to fight for their welfare rather than exploit their vulnerability. The foundation I established grew rapidly, supported by donations from military families and civilian supporters who understood the importance of protecting service members from financial predators. Within 2 years, the foundation had helped 43 families access emergency medical funding for children's surgeries and treatments. Each family assisted represented a small victory against the kind of exploitation that Brad had practiced. Military service members could focus on their missions overseas, knowing that their families had resources available if medical emergencies arose during deployment. Emma's 5th birthday marked the end of our family's crisis and the beginning of a new chapter built on truthfulness, accountability, and genuine care for each other's welfare. The little girl who had once faced death due to adult greed was now thriving, surrounded by people committed to protecting rather than exploiting her innocence. As I tucked Emma into bed that night, she looked up at me with the trust and love that made every difficult choice worthwhile. Daddy, was today a good day? Today was a perfect day, sweetheart. You're healthy, you're loved, and you're surrounded by people who will always protect you. Even when I'm grown up, even when you're grown up. And someday when you have children of your own, you'll understand why some choices are more important than being comfortable. Emma smiled and closed her eyes, secure in the knowledge that her world was safe and her future was bright. Her peaceful sleep represented the ultimate victory over those who had tried to profit from her suffering. Looking back on everything our family had endured, I understood that true love sometimes requires painful choices that prioritize long-term welfare over short-term harmony. My decision to expose my parents' crimes had saved Emma's life, dismantled a criminal network targeting military families, and created opportunities for genuine redemption among those willing to face the truth about their actions. The greatest gift I could give Emma was the knowledge that she was worth fighting for, even when that fight required confronting people we love who have lost their way. Justice and mercy could coexist when accountability led to authentic transformation rather than continued harm. Have you ever faced a situation where protecting someone you love required making choices that others couldn't understand? Sometimes the most difficult decisions in life come from choosing between loyalty to family and loyalty to principles, especially when innocent people are caught in the middle. I'd love to hear your thoughts about how we balance love and justice when they seem to conflict with each other. Thank you for following Emma's story with me. I hope it reminds you that healing is possible even after the deepest betrayals, and that children's futures are worth any sacrifice required to protect them. If this story touched your heart, please like this video. Subscribe for more real-life stories about family, justice, and redemption, and share it with others who might need reminding that good people sometimes have to make hard choices to protect the ones they love most. Until next time, remember that your principles matter most when following them costs you something precious.